Hi, everyone. This is Dean DeFino from the English department, and I wanted to talk about storytelling today, in particular the relationship between the story and the way in which it's told. And in order to do that, I'm going to focus on the humorous narrative, or more specifically, the joke. Now, there are three aspects of story that I'm particularly interested in here, or ways in which we think about them that I think will help us to understand how the humorous narrative works. The first is that a story delivers information or instruction of some sort. So, creation myth tells us something about the way in which human beings have historically related to the universe, or an Aesop's fable will give us moral or ethical instruction of some sort. We also think of narrative stories as a form of entertainment, right? Often an escapist entertainment, a way of getting out of our lives and into some other type of reality. And finally, we think of stories in relation to emotion. They make us feel certain things, right? A tragedy might make us feel a sense of horror or shame or grief or pity or whatever. A comedy might make us feel mirth or amusement, something of that sort. Humor is a particularly useful way of thinking about the ways in which stories act upon us, or the things that they do for us, for three particular reasons. The first is that humor, uh, um, our response to humor begins with reaction prior to reflection. What do I mean by that? Well, when you hear a joke, you will laugh at it before you've had the opportunity for your mind to sort of process the meaning or the value of it, right? So you're just amused by it and laughter comes out. And then maybe you reflect on it further and you think that wasn't particularly funny, or that was offensive, or something like that. But our visceral response, our bodily response precedes, it comes before that reflection. And this is an incredibly important aspect of performance in comedy. It's something that comedians in particular absolutely rely on. The second is that humor is a kind of form of containment. I like to think of a joke sort of like a white blood cell that surrounds a virus and pulls it out of the body, right? You can talk about all sorts of things in humor. In fact, things that you would never talk about, say, in a drama, right? Or wouldn't talk about in a particular way, because it's a safe space, or because it's perceived of in any case like that. Now, this can be a very abused boundary. For example, when someone crosses some sort of line, they'll often kind of use the excuse, well, it was only a joke, right? But they're drawing from this sort of sense that humor is basically about creating a sort of container or a wall around something to protect us from it. And related to that, humor is also built basically on catharsis, an emotional release. When we laugh at something, it's coming out of our bodies, right? That it's a way of kind of releasing the tension that's created by whatever the subject matter is. So let's say it's a joke about death, for example, and there's a great deal of discomfort around that. The laughter that we're feeling allows us to release the tension that the thought of death produces in us, right? So that containment and that catharsis are directly related to each other. And finally, humor is capable of working at multiple levels or registers at the same time. A single joke can be real, surreal, and absurd at the same time. For example, one of my favorite comedians, Tig Notaro, and the quote that I have here, which is from a much longer story that she tells, of a friend of hers and her, um, trying to produce a video. And there's a scene in it in which one of them gets into a bathtub with Santa Claus, and they decide to go to McDonald's. They take a break. They're sitting there in the parking lot, and they see this woman behaving in a strange way and begin to record it on one of their phones. And in the process of recording, this man who looks exactly like Santa Claus whizzes by in a car. And they have a direct response to that. They say, "Oh my God, it's Santa Claus." And, "Oh my God, do you think he'll talk to us?" So it's real in the sense that they're sitting in a McDonald's parking lot and observing the behavior of the patrons, which is something that I think many of us could relate to. It's surreal in the sense that suddenly Santa Claus rides by at the very moment where they're searching for Santa Claus. And then it is absurd because it turns out that the only thing that's recorded on the phone is their voices saying, "Oh my God, it's Santa Claus. Oh my God, do you think he'll talk to us?" Which sounds ridiculous when taken out of context. So all three of those registers are operating in the same story or the same joke. Now, jokes have a particular structure to them, and it should be a familiar one. It's a three-act structure, like any other story, with a setup, a complication, and a resolution. We refer to the resolution in a joke as a punchline. Jokes can be very economical in the way that they tell stories. For example, one of the most famous one-liners of all time, which is only 4 words long, is in fact a three-act story, right? Take My Wife, Please, by the comedian Henny Youngman, who's pictured there on the left. Um, it's a setup, take my wife, and in this case, that phrase means take my wife as an example. The punchline comes please, right? That's the kicker here, and it changes the meaning of the original phrase. So it goes from being take my wife as an example to please take my wife from me, right? It becomes the complication. It's the setup and the complication in that joke. So we have a really economical story being told here and of just 4 words. And then we have what I refer to as squeezing out sparks, or the compounding value that can often come with a joke or with a story that is taking the form of a joke. Tangents, for example, where you're talking about something that doesn't appear to have anything to do with the central plot of the joke, for lack of a better phrase. Callbacks, where maybe you make a reference to something at the beginning of a story and then it comes up again at the end, often in the form of a punchline or a second punchline, which we refer to as a tag, right? A tag is just a punchline that compounds upon the original one. So the example I give you here, there's a setup that becomes also the complication, just with the Henny Youngman joke. We spent 3 days baby proofing the house. That sounds like the setup to a joke, but it also turns out to be the complication. But she managed to get back in is the punchline. So the baby proofing is the thing that creates the conflict in this. And then there's a tag, which is a second punchline. Basically, somehow she found the doggy door in the garage. Again, really economical storytelling here, built upon the basic structure of a 3-act story. And then we have some other kind of elements of a joke. We have, for example, the target. It's a kind of truism that there's no such thing as a joke without a victim, right? There's always something at which it's directed. In the Henny Youngman joke, it's his wife. We have conflict that grows out of that. I'm trying to get rid of her, right? That there's something going on in the story that needs to be resolved in the same way that any other narrative would have conflict. There's a basis in reality, some way in which we can relate to what's going on in the joke, because if we can't relate to it, it's difficult for us to see the humor in it. Spouses and partners can be exasperating. Anyone who's ever been in a long-term relationship can relate to that. That's part of their reality. Then that reality is exaggerated in some way, where he basically says in this joke that living with his wife, living this way in this marriage has become unbearable. Clearly, it's not unbearable. He's doing this just for comic effect. There's emotion, pleading at the end of the joke. The punchline is, in fact, the expression of an emotion. And then finally, surprise. And I talked about this in the previous frame. Take my wife becomes take my wife, right? There's not an inversion necessarily, but there's a transformation of the meaning of a phrase simply by the insertion of another word. Again, economical use of joke elements. But jokes are also performative, right? Even if they're just written down on a page, there is some sense of the way in which they are to be read or to be understood or to be received as a member of the audience. And the easiest way to think about comedic performance is in terms of 3 challenges that anyone telling a joke faces. The first is maybe the biggest, which is keeping the attention of the audience. Right? You're standing there with a microphone up on a stage. You're better lit than anybody else in the auditorium if you're a stand-up comedian. But that only goes so far. If your jokes aren't landing or if people aren't interested in what you have to say, their attention is going to wane, right? So how do we keep people's attention? Well, it's the same way we keep attention in any kind of a performance. It's about timing. It's about pacing. It's about tone, right? It's about posture, the way one stands on the stage. It's about movement. A great example of a comedian who's really adept at keeping attention is Dave Chappelle, who's pictured there on the left, maybe the greatest living stand-up comedian, who uses posture as a way of expressing certain ideas. You can see the way he's sort of letting his shoulders go up and his head drop in this particular image, where he's just sort of delivered a piece of information in a joke that might be controversial for some people. So his body, rather than expressing attack, is expressing a sort of retreat. He's drawing back a little bit. If you've ever seen Dave Chappelle, he'll often turn away from the audience, bounce the microphone on his knee, and sort of laugh off something that's particularly potentially offensive or problematic for members of the audience. All of this is part of that attention keeping aspect of performance. How do I keep eyes on me? How do I keep people listening to what I have to say? And then there's pitching appeal. In other words, getting people to sympathize, empathize, feel pity, or in some cases feel antipathy toward you. There are comedians who are not necessarily looking to get the audience to agree with or like them. They actually want to create a kind of tension between them. The comedian Bill Burr will often do this, for example. More often, pitching appeal is done through some act of relatability, right? I'm going to tell a story that's familiar to you. You'll see the kind of parameters of it, and you'll know why I behaved in a particular way, whether you agree or disagree with it, right? So pitching appeal is basically, how do you get the audience to go along with you? And then finally is effect. And effect in humor is everything. Because if we don't laugh, effect is the thing that it produces in us, right? If we're not laughing, if we're not amused by a joke or by a story, that joke has failed, right? In the eyes of almost any audience member who isn't necessarily interested in kind of breaking the thing down critically. If it doesn't amuse me, it's no good, right? And humor is ruthless in this way, in a way that other sorts of modes of storytelling aren't. In a drama, for example, if we don't cry, that doesn't mean that we necessarily see the drama as a failure. But if a joke doesn't make us laugh, it's no good. That's the sort of final judgment. At this point, I want to ask you to, or ask your instructors to pause this presentation and show you a story called The Banana Story, about 8 minutes long, that comes at the beginning of a series of 4 one-hour specials recorded for Netflix in 2017 by a British comedian named James Acaster. Now, there are a couple things that's worth knowing about. And by the way, if you have Netflix, I strongly urge you to watch the entire 4-part series. The stories are, or I should say the specials are interconnected with each other. There's an overriding theme and they kind of circle back on each other as well. But there are 2 things that I want you to know going in. The first is that the Banana Story, which you're about to see, comes at the very beginning of the first of the 4 performances, the one called Recognize. There's a kind of a slight intro thing at the beginning, but this is the first story that we hear. So it's worth knowing that. And by the way, the performer, James Acaster, is performing it while he's on his knees. There's an explanation for why he's doing this that comes a little bit later in the narrative, but you have to watch the special in order to know what that is. The second is that he refers to a popular British takeaway sandwich shop, basically, called Pret a Manger, which if you've ever been in the UK or anywhere in Europe, in fact, if you've looked around Midtown Manhattan, because there are a couple of them there, you may have seen a Pret a Manger. It's important to know a couple of things about that. First of all, it's a British company. It's not a French one, even though the phrase, the name is French. Pret a Manger means ready to eat. What Acaster is doing there is essentially laughing at the pretense of that name, right? And it becomes a really important element in the story that he's going to tell. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to let your instructors show you that video, and then we will proceed. So first, let's look at the kind of formal elements of this joke. And by the way, I recognize that, in explaining a joke, I'm robbing it of all humor, right? That's just the, that's a professional hazard. That's just the way it goes. This is a funny story, right? And it's important for me to sort of say that up front. Structurally speaking, there are the basic elements of a joke here. We have the 3-act structure. We have a setup. In fact, we have a fairly complicated one here, where he says, there are 2 things you need to know about me. I bear a lot of grudges, which is going to become really important in the story. And I love French cuisine, which is the beginning of this joke about Pret a Manger. Pret a Manger is not a French restaurant. It's an English sandwich house with a a ludicrous name. Then we have a complication, in fact, multiple of them. We have the pret-a-manger stuff, and then we have the kind of yogurt business, which is a bit of a tangent, as we'll talk about in a minute. There's the conflict over free bananas, and then the exit and this too good for free bananas business, where he leaves the shop, right? And then finally, the resolution, which is actually two resolutions. The first is that he sets up a banana shop in spite in this battle of wills between himself and this customer service representative, for lack of a cashier, let's say, at the Pret-a-Manger, excuse me, and then eating all the bananas, which becomes a kind of tag on that punchline resolution. So there's this basic 3-act structure. And then we have the elements of a joke here as well, and some of which I've conflated. There's a target. In fact, there are two of them. There's the pretentiousness of Pret-a-Manger, its name and its client, or its, pardon me, its employees, but also the comedian's own pettiness, that his response is clearly exaggerated and overblown in this case, and undeserved, right? That it far exceeds the offense. So he's kind of laughing at himself here. There's the conflict with customer service, obviously, and then the scorn in particular that customer service feels toward him. It becomes a mutual scorn, as we see as the joke plays out. There's a basis in reality, which is actually connected to the emotion here. It is a relatable story in the sense that all of us have had trouble with customer service in the past, and we know what it is to feel that anger and embarrassment and even humiliation that's connected with it, right? So that's sort of the way in which as a performer, he's drawing us in emotionally. And finally, there's exaggeration and surprise. That he opens a spite store is obviously a ludicrous response to the offense, and that he ends up eating all of the bananas is kind of a punchline and a tag and a big sort of reveal at the end of the joke. Then there are those sort of bits that are added on, the squeezing out sparks, the compounding of the joke. We have tangents, including the business about eating the yogurt and getting the fruit out of the corner of the cup. Callbacks, who's too good for a free banana now? I'm too good for a free banana now, which calls back to that original sort of mumbling of the cashier at the Pret-a-Manger. And finally, tags, which we've already talked about. And one of my favorite tags in this, and there are multiple of them, is never before have I been so offended by something I 100% agreed with, because there's a deep irony in this. And of course, it gets back to that idea, what's the target? Is it the individual that he's creating this sort of revenge narrative over, or is it him? And of course, it's both, as we see in this tag. The performative aspects, of course, are absolutely essential to understanding what's going on here. And Acaster is using all sorts of means to meet the 3 primary challenges in performance. The first is keeping attention. I've already mentioned the kneeling, which is important here, right? He's standing up on a stage with a microphone and he's well lit, as I said before, but he's ceding some of that power by getting down on his knees. He's literally taking himself closer to the level of the audience, right? So this is partly about a power relationship, but it's also, and please watch the rest of that particular episode, about something else as well. He also keeps attention through vocal inflection. Acaster is famous for having this sort of shrill performative voice where he seems always to be on the verge of some sort of an anxiety attack. So that becomes a way of drawing our ears to him. We're listening to find out what's so urgent in that voice. He's certainly pitching appeal, his exasperation and frustration with customer service. He pitches appeal by confiding in the audience about what his feelings are and why he responded in the way that he does. So he's literally trying to get us to sympathize with him here, to see ourselves in kind of in his shoes. And finally, the effect, right? And this is the tricky part of measuring and understanding any performance, because we need to ask ourselves why we laugh. We go back to that, what I was talking about earlier, the reactive versus the reflective, right? That we react, I do anyway, I'll speak for myself here, very often, and I've seen this many, many times now, very often I'm laughing even before I understand what is being said. There's something in the joke that sets that off. And being attentive to that and the ways in which the performer is kind of exercising their skills in order to produce that effect, in order to get us to laugh, is essential to understanding our relationship to it. It's a very subjective relationship. We all laugh for different reasons and at different times, but it is an absolutely essential aspect to understanding how the thing works, which brings us back to where we started. which is the connection between the what and the how, at least as I understand it. The what is the story, right? But storytelling is as much about the how it is told. And as a result of how it is told, we begin to understand the why, which is, why is this person telling this story? Why do they want me to conceive of it in a particular way? Why have they taken a certain tone? Why are they using an unreliable narrator to tell the story instead of a reliable one, for example? All of these other sorts of questions come up in the space between the what and the how, right? Whether we're talking about a comedic performance on a stage or a literary text, there is always an aspect of telling in it, right? We know what a narrator does, and we know that they have certain limitations that are built in and certain abilities that are, to a certain extent, beyond our understanding even sometimes. That we, why is there an omniscient narrator in a particular, why are they telling the story, right? Can be a really tricky thing to dope out, but we can tell from the tone, we can tell from the way in which it postures itself in relationship to the text, etc. All those how things, we can begin at least to understand the why.